Hello and welcome, colleagues. Thanks so much for joining us today. I am excited for what is our fourth session in a series of webinars that we've been doing, focusing on Beyond the Reading, where we speak to authors about the stories behind their published papers related to research with international students. We're a friendly group of familiar colleagues in the room today, but if you're joining us on the recording and this is your first Research with International Students event, then just to say that we're a network of scholars and researchers who include international students as participants or co-researchers within our work. And we take a critical disposition towards reimagining problematic narratives of international students that are present in existing research. So my name is Jenna Mittelmeier. I'm one of the co-founders and organizers of the network, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Ana Luisa Muñoz García from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. And today we're going to be talking about her paper, which is Outing Class in the Process of Internationalization. For this series, what we've done is we've asked authors to share a photograph that they feel represents themselves as a scholar, as a way to introduce themselves and the person behind the paper. So I'll share that from Ana Luisa in just a moment. We'll then follow with some discussion with Ana Luisa about her paper. And then at the end, there's time for questions and discussions from colleagues in the room. So you're welcome to type your question in the chat if you'd like me to read it out loud for you, or you can just say in the chat if you'd like to speak out loud. And as we've done in the past, if you want to send a question directly to me as a private message, you can do that to have it read out loud anonymously. But with that said, Ana Luisa, I'm going to hand over to you. I'm going to share the photograph that you shared with me as your introduction. 1 second. Let me try that again. So can you tell us about yourself, introduce yourself, and why did you choose this photograph?
Thanks, Gina. First, thank you for inviting me to have this conversation. I guess it's usually relevant to have different voices in terms of territory. So I really appreciate this space and the patience you have with me, inviting me and changing also the time that I couldn't have the meeting before. I am Ana Luisa, I am a professor in Chile. And these pictures is meaningful because you see various scholars nowadays, but this was back in 2000, I guess, 2008, no, 2007, at the end of 2007, when at that moment, Michelle Bachelet government, the first one, created a new international scholarship. It was called Equal Opportunities Fulbright Scholarship. And that scholarship changed kind of one criteria for selection to have a scholarship to go abroad to study a PhD. And this was that people didn't have to have the English skills. So the scholarship, what added, it was a course of English abroad, so you could do a PhD in another country, specifically in the United States. So for the first time, the population of people who can apply for an international scholarship was different because they didn't have English skills. In Chile, because we have a high unequal education, most of people who could go abroad because they have the English skills was people who are coming from private education and of course for upper class background. So this picture is important because here is where my doctoral dissertation emerged, but here also is where this paper emerged because of the tensions that this scholarship creates abroad, because there were now two kinds of scholars, the ones who were coming with English skills and the ones who were not, and that means a class background. So that's why this picture is important, and mostly because most of them now are my friends. All of them, we were together studying English, and then we were studying a PhD abroad, and we create a very strong and important community of support abroad. So that's why I was sharing this picture. This is the moment that they kind of launched the scholarship with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and with the people who won at that moment the scholarship.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I'll just stop sharing here. But I think what is so fascinating about that is how over the last few sessions we've done in this series, I think all of the scholars have brought a photograph that is with other people. And I think, you know, it really speaks to kind of the relational aspect of research in this area, whether that's family or colleagues. Yeah, just a really interesting observation, I think, across the different photos that people have brought in. But let's get started kind of talking about your paper. So I think I'm really excited to talk about this paper with you today because it's one that I often use as an example for how to think about migration in a more kind of intersectional way. And in your case, talking about the intersections of migration and class. But I think for those of us who maybe haven't read the article or maybe want to check their understanding, can you give us just a really brief summary of what your key argument or the key point you're trying to make in this article is?
Yeah. Well, as I say, this article is about class differences, specifically in the process of moving abroad, the process of internationalization. And I guess there, what is the main article is that when you move abroad, territoriality plays a strong role in making you think about class difference, mostly when you are coming from countries like Chile, where the class differences, the social class differences are very, very strong. When you are coming from a high unequal country, you know, like the fact that you move abroad, you have different questions, you have different treatment, you meet different people. That tension in some ways, the ways you are reading class as a main marker of difference becomes relevant. And that is the main argument that this paper that I call outing class, like putting class out of the closet, is what I have there.
Yeah, and you've spoken a little bit about kind of the context of where this paper came from, but can you put us in the context of where were you in your life when you wrote this article? Kind of what was happening in your career or your life that might have contributed to writing this article?
Yeah, there is a lot of kind of details that sometimes is may reach a paper. Like usually you don't have the space to tell these stories, but I was a doctoral student when I was doing the research for this paper. I wrote this paper later and it was accepted like very years later. And so I've been having that discussion with this paper for almost 10 years, actually. But I was a doctoral student almost in my third year. And it was a course for a year of qualitative research. And what I did in that course was to do interviews to students, international students in the US from Chile who call themselves upper class students, you know, like this difference that this scholarship created, it was attention usually abroad, because the experience that international students who declare themselves coming from upper class background have a different experience, have a different kind of discourse about what is going on abroad, compared to these other, in between quotes, other international students who were coming with this new scholarship. So there was always this conversation, okay, which scholarship are you coming from? Something very Chilean, you know, that was not happening with the students from other countries. That was happening between Chilean international students. So when I start to hear all this story about the differences of the experience abroad, you know, like mostly in the case of students coming from upper class background, this idea that they were not treated very well, like in Chile, I was like, that is interesting, because coming from Chile, I was like, I don't receive that treatment in Chile. You know, like I receive like a common treatment. So the idea that in Chile, people usually in stores treat you very well, that people really kind of, this kind of conform idea about nationality, that was something that they say, you know, I feel kind of more relaxed even abroad, you know, like I don't feel that kind of protection of my nationality inside of Chile. So from there, the question about territory came relevant, to think about subjectivity, to think about difference, to think about identities, to think about who I was abroad and who were my colleagues abroad. And I was doing all that kind of question, you know, why is different? Why my experience is, at that moment, why my experience was so different? And the experience of my, that community I show you in the picture was so different compared to the other people that usually were the ones who have the possibility to go abroad to study a PhD.
Yeah, I love that you actually published this work so long after your PhD, because I think so many of us finish a PhD and have these grand ideas for papers, and you actually did it. So well done.
Yeah.
It sounds like though the time, you know, having space and time away from your PhD and your doctoral experience was actually really valuable for kind of putting your thoughts together for this work.
Yeah, I mean, I had class conversation about social class. It was very important in my PhD. I was working with Lois Weiss, who is a scholar who had been working for, I don't know, decades about social class issues in the United States. So also, and reading bell hooks at that moment, which I highly recommend, the book Class Matters, made me think a lot about the lived experience of social class in the day-to-day, you know. So all those day-to-day experience that usually came out then in my interviews were relevant to understand those positionalities in the ways that internationalization was much more than thinking about how you get more privilege or how you get a credentials that give you more, increase your salaries, things like that, you know, like implies to think, okay, what in your day-to-day is changing, in your way to think is changing, the possibility to move abroad. So it was to think that internationalization was deeper and deeper than to think about rankings or international rankings for universities and in the policies they were creating.
Yeah. And what was the experience like actually writing this paper? Did you come across any kind of stumbling blocks in the writing or the review process, or what was that experience like for you?
You know, it was the second one, because this paper have like two kind of, I say two moments. And it was pretty pedagogical, you know, like doing pedagogy at the same time you were doing research. And I say that because I guess what for me was more complex to analyze this paper, it was too personal at the same time, you know, I was too embedded in the idea of what social class means in a high unequal society like Chilean, that where I am coming from. So when I say pedagogical, it was interesting, the second paper, to think about sharing the process of what I was doing, the process that made me think and write what I wrote, more than sharing the results, more than sharing me, what I found, in between quotes, what I found in the research. It was sharing the process that made me think in that way, the process that took me to lead, mostly what I was reading, you know, what was informing at that moment the study I was doing, and what now is tensioning what I was reading 10 years ago. You know what I mean? Like, in that sense, for me, it's very pedagogical process to write about internationalization, because something I had been thinking a lot is like how it's moving theoretically the conversation about internationalization, which made me more difficult now to write about that than before, definitely.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you speak to a tension that a lot of us working in this field really feel, especially those of us who have migration experiences ourselves, the kind of embeddedness of the self within that process of writing. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, but at the same, sorry to interrupt you, but at the
No,
same time, coming at that moment, coming from a country from the south, I was not thinking from a decolonial way. You know, I was not having the literature at that moment in my hands that I guess if I had that literature, probably I will have writing differently. And that was something that came when I was back to Chile. I met other scholars with whom I am working right now. Andrea Lira, Elisa Noncon, I had been writing about the colonial knowledge. That made me think different today about, okay, this is very important to think and add another layer about the idea and the conversation, how we understand territoriality and place and space and so on.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And I think that's actually something I wanted to ask you about in terms of, I think, there are a lot of embedded assumptions, and most of those are assumptions coming from global north spaces about who international students are in regards to class, and predominantly this assumption that international students are affluent or are coming from significant means. So what's your sense of, I mean, what do you think researchers in this area misunderstand or ignore about class?
I think that I think more than misunderstanding, I think is usually omitted in the conversation. You know, there is an assumption that about class that people are coming from middle class or upper class, because to travel abroad, you need money, you need some kind of cultural capital, social capital to understand how to move in another country and how the university system move and so on. And not all people have that. And so there is an assumption that people should know some kind of movement internationally, and that implies some kind of social class background. So I think there is more than a misunderstanding, there is this omission about class. So what I had been learning with this study and the conversation I had in the past from this paper is that social class is a fundamental organizer, and not just about what you choose, which university you choose, which area of knowledge you choose, the people, the ways you meet and relate to other peoples, you know, what you do in those countries when you move abroad are organized by class, you know, as a social organizer, as a structure that put in front of you the range of options about the choices that you are making. And I guess from there, to omit that kind of marker in our process is complex, is problematic. It's problematic because the experience that a person who, I insist about this unequal, the idea that countries that are very unequal, you know, like highly unequal in terms of social class. When you are coming from a country like that, the experience that you will have as a person from a class, a working class background or upper class background will be totally different. The needs that you have, you know, I went to the United States, for example. In this case, I will become very personal, but I went to with a scholarship that didn't cover my, for example, ophthalmologist, that didn't cover some issues of my health. And I didn't have enough money, you know? So the fact that I didn't have an assistantship because I couldn't, because of the scholarship, it was like complex. How I explain to people that I really need to go to medical assistance. And that is something that maybe if you're coming from an upper class, you will have the possibility to have support for that. And we didn't. So when I was asking back to my government, say, hey, I need you to put the money in the bank. Sometimes they forgot to put the money, or they have some issues in Chile. And for them was like, well, ask your parents. It was like, what? It's like my parents don't have enough money for sending me, I don't know, $1,000, $2,000 to the United States. And those kind of experiences are crucial to understand how policies later are created. No, because there are amazing intention with this equal opportunity scholarship. I am not criticizing that, but definitely omit so many issues that were important when you move abroad with a scholarship. I don't know if it makes sense for you, but.
No, I think it makes perfect sense. And I think when I was reading your paper the first time, it really got me thinking about these preconceived notions of class and who classed others are, and the way that might be influenced by, you know, my own understanding of my own class identity or the space where I grew up, which might not be relevant to other people and to other spaces. And I know that your context for your research is within Chile, and you speak a lot within this article about kind of class shapings of Chile and how that's influencing students' experiences. So I wonder, can you talk a little bit about place in your research, and how kind of how is context embedded in the work that you're undertaking?
My research now, or my research.
I think specifically about this paper, but if you want to speak about how
Okay.
you've moved beyond that in recent years, that'd be interesting as well.
Well, this research is highly connected with my doctoral dissertation, which I was working with doctoral students where they were coming back. You know, some questions that people asked me with this paper at that moment it was like, okay, what will happen when them go back to Chile? Because these was people who were highly privileged in terms of social class. And the conversation during the research and the focus group, the interviews, what they were opening is reflections about things that we usually don't talk in Chile. You know, this uncomfortable place about putting class at the center of the conversation, which I love, by the way. So they say in the conversations, in the focus group, in the interviews, they say, you know, we don't talk about these issues in Chile. This is something, it's unpolite to talk about social class. I feel uncomfortable. So the fact they were opening and tensioning the discussion and reflecting about social class and how privilege work at home and abroad made me wonder at that moment, okay, what will happen then? You know, what will happen when they are back? I don't know because I didn't do that research, but yes, I got curious about what happened if you were, and that is something that Joanna Fahey and Jen Kay, we had been writing a lot, by the way. When you travel abroad, you were open in some ways, you know, you start to think about otherwise, you start to think stuff that they were not common to think in your home country. But what happened when you are coming back? And mostly because behind those kind of human capital idea that exists, at least in Chile, in the policies of formation of human capital, is that when you go abroad, you come back with new knowledge, with innovation, you know, changing the research and becoming a leader in research. However, we are a very conservative and highly conservative country. So when you are coming back with all those, between quote, new ideas, it's very difficult to engage with what is going on in a conservative academy, you know, academia. And that becomes complex. And that's our other papers, you know, there is a paper I call Intellectual Endogamy, where I am explaining all this, you know, how this conservative and neoliberal academia became problematic for the fact that you want to work in a different type of, sometimes different type of knowledge. And because we are highly conservative, but at the same time, university acts here to be highly productive. So this combination between the neoliberal regulation and conservative neoliberal become a bomb and a wall to really create, in between quotes, innovation. I don't know if it makes sense, but I was working at that moment with that parallel research on internationalization.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of complex factors that are entering into the equation of the experience that people are having. So how do you, how as a researcher do you navigate that? Because class is not just about class, of course, it's intersecting with all these other factors. So how do you find an area of narrowed research focus when you're working in this area?
What do you mean narrow by narrow research?
Yeah, I
Sorry.
mean, I think, you know, your focus on class within this paper, for example, how did you decide to focus on class as the key element when there's so many other factors that could have played a role within the experience people are having?
Yeah, I guess because it's, in the case of Chile, is the main market of differentiation. It's too obvious for me. You know, like there is a writer, her name is Isabel Allende, and she has this amazing novel. If you come to Chile, you have to read that novel. It's called My Invented Country. And you know, usually Isabel Allende is put in the level of surrealism. She's not surrealist, she's Chilean. That is the issue. So the fun part of this is that she has this quote in that book. It's a novel, not surrealistic, and that say that Chilean society is like a mifel pastry, like a cake with different and thousand of layers. Each people in each kind of cake, cuts, you know, in layers, different to the others. They speak differently. They dress differently. They have a different accent, all by social class. You know, like in other countries, she say people differ their accent because of geographical areas. In Chile, it's because of social class. So there is ton of TikTok videos that explain how different social class background people speak differently. So the interesting idea of that is that when you think about such a organizer of our social life, of how we interact each others, become tensioned abroad. For me, that was the most interesting part of this paper, like how something that is very, between quotes, natural for us, the question we ask, they usually came out in the interviews. We have three basic questions. Where are you from? When they from is the neighborhood you live. Where did you study your high school? And where did you go to holidays? Those three questions say a lot about your social class background, which is very interesting because then in the interviews people were telling, then you ask those the same question to other people who are not Chilean. And you cannot read something that we usually are reading, even in the subway. There was one part of the interview that was very interesting for me. It was a guy who said, I asked him, how do you know the social class background of people in Chile? And he said, because of the hair. And I was like, what? The hair? And he said, yeah, the hair, but not the color of the hair. It's the texture of the hair. And I was like, how would that become possible? And he said, because people, according to social class background, use different shampoos. That was his answer. And so for me, it was like, at that level of reading, we have internalized in our society. So when you read surrealism from Isabel Allende about Chile, it's not that, it's reality, which is fun, but at the same time, it speaks a lot about how social class define how we relate each other. And that we can become tensioned abroad because we cannot read in the same way. And that was something that came out from the interviews. I know it makes sense. That
Yeah, I'm adding that book to my reading list now. Thank you for the suggestion. But I think that's the really fascinating aspect about your work is how that ingrained knowledge when traveling to a new space, that knowledge doesn't apply in the same way. And can you talk a little bit about that intersection with migration, and what happens with class when people migrate?
Yeah, what I found that for me also was interesting is the idea that international students from Chile wanted to differentiate from migrants for other reasons. And that for me was kind of complex to see, like we are Chileans, but we are not the same Chileans. And when you see that there is a different construction about what place and time means, And when you travel as Chilean, you find a lot with people who went abroad and stay abroad because of the dictatorship in Chile during the 80s, 70s, and 80s. So those people have all these ideas about this melancholy about Chile, and you learn about something that we didn't learn as generation because we grew up in dictatorship. However, this need that some students have to differentiate each other about, no, I am here because of a PhD and not because I am a migrant for economical reasons, for me also have a strong connection with how we construct social class in Chile. Because I didn't see in that way at that level in other international students like Chileans, sometimes Colombian too. I did another student with Colombian international students. And it's very strong, that need to say, I am an international student and not a migrant worker. Actually, there is one interview with a Colombian woman, and she started telling me in the interview a story that she was the daughter of a ministry or something like that, minister. And she was brown, like most of the Latin American people. So in the airport, police was interrogating her because she was coming from Colombia. And she started to tell him, look at me, look at me, look at me. And then she, in the same interview, she was reflecting, saying, that was so stupid. And I was like, why? And she was like, because the policeman, see a Latino woman, period. He doesn't see class. He doesn't see that even I am brown in my country, nobody will question me in the airport, So all those constructions get tension because of the privilege you have or not have at home. When I say at home, in your own country. And then you move abroad and start to have all these kind of situations that you get obligate you to think otherwise, to ask questions that maybe you didn't have before.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes me think of the kind of the ways that international students are homogenized by their institutions in ways that when you're part of the group, you see those different layers as you were referring to, but probably as a practitioner or a teacher in that space, you're not seeing that in the same way that students are seeing about each other.
Exactly. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah.
Let's talk about your findings a bit, going back to the paper. So in your findings section, in this paper, you're talking about how class is denaturalized. So can you talk to us about what do you mean by that, and what do you think that concept means within this research?
Yeah, I guess for me, the idea of denaturalization again comes from the fact that for us to read social class and to differentiate each other based on that is very natural. It's kind of something that we don't ask so much, but it happens in our every day when you move in the subway, when you move in the university and different spaces. To denaturalize class for me was a way to tension and to put at the center something that it was uncomfortable and unpolite to talk. That was a way to denaturalize, say, hey, we don't talk about that, because the resistance was very strong at the beginning. It was like, I don't talk about those issues because I am not a classist. I don't want to be called as classist, or I feel uncomfortable because, I am privileged, but it's where I am from, period. I am a snob person, but I don't want to be discriminated against. This idea of doesn't exist, according to me, reverse discrimination. It was very common to hear in the interviews. So the idea of denaturalization, it was, again, this process of putting at the center something that we, for Chilean society, is natural, but it is not. Because how we construct privilege is something that is a process that have organization that is created that is not natural. It's not that the color of your eyes or something like that. It's something that we create as society. And the same way that we create a society, we can interrupt, we can tension, we can question, we can decide that there is nothing natural about social class difference. That was the idea of denaturalization that I have in the paper, and I try to create in different conversations I'm having about this and other issues too,
It makes me wonder, as a researcher, how do you navigate trying to encourage people to talk about something that they feel uncomfortable with talking about? How did you navigate that in your
I
work?
don't know. I really like your research a lot. I added a question in the interviews how they construct me in terms of social class,
Ooh,
just to make this stuff more uncomfortable. At the end of the interview, say, okay, the last question is that. It was interesting because they try to be very polite, like, I have access to this research because my scholarship, because even for us, a Chilean, those were two types of Fulbright scholarship. For United States, Fulbrighters are Fulbrighters. They don't care which scholarship you came from, so they put us all together always. Something that in the embassy or in the house of the ambassador, everyone was looking at each other like in a strange way sometimes. How I did navigate this, I guess with a lot of patience sometimes when I hear statements that were complex about the justification of classism, for example. Like I am a kind of person that I am very sensitive about social justice issues. So when I see sometimes the justification about classism, because when the stories about class differences, of class discrimination, social class discrimination emerged in the interviews, I couldn't stop asking how did you feel or what did you do about that? And always the answer was like silence, and that is how it's the perpetuation of the discrimination in general. So at that moment for me it was complex to hear those kind of, again, naturalization of the class discrimination in Chile. and the justification of why we don't do nothing, you know, and because I am a historian too, you know, I study history, that is my background as an undergrad student. For me, what thing I have learned from history is that it's important to be conscious about what is your positionality in terms of justice. It's just history. So I navigate trying to listen and trying to also put this in a bigger context, you know, like how classism, as well as other structure of discrimination, racism, and so on, gender issues, is that it's a structure. It's not an event. It's not something that we as Chilean, I include myself in that process too, can escape easily. And we need surveillance, self-surveillance, to constantly be thinking how we also are reading class, and sometimes we establish different ways to relate each other based on that reading. And now I see it even as a professor, you know, and you have students that are coming with different class backgrounds to your room, and how you treat people differently, because that is a fact, and how you surveillance, you get a self-surveillance about that. It's important. It's become my sometimes day-to-day conversation, and not just in that issue. Another, if we think intersectionality as a way to approach to the reality too, as with other mark of differentiation to sexuality, gender, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think how I think a lot of traditional research design, you know, the way that a lot of researchers are taught is to limit discomfort and to avoid discomfort. But it sounds, I mean, class is discomforting, and that doesn't mean it's any less of a important topic. And it seems by leaning into that discomfort that it was an important part of the stories that your participants were saying.
And yeah, I mean, for me, we have this compulsive policies on internationalization in Chile in 2008. And when I read the policy and then the conversations on that policy, which is was a government one, I see so many spots that I think that they were not thinking. And that became problematic later, you know. And one of them was class issues. Like, even that you have this equal opportunity scholarship, that equal opportunity still assume who we were and what will happen with our lives abroad. And I think that it's complex. I mean, a policy cannot encapsulate everything, but at least to think about what were the needs of peoples abroad, the tensions that were happening abroad among Chilean international students from Chile, become something that it was worth to see further and to think and reflect, and that is still happening when people are coming back, you know. What happened when you later you come back, and that's mostly is the work of Tia too in China. What it means to have an international degree, and the opportunities you have. In the case of Chile, still social class is the main factor. There is an interesting study from Roxana Chapa, Paulina Perez, about privilege. It's called privilege, the privilege. Privilegiando de los privilegiados. I have no, it's difficult to pronounce in English. And what the study shows is a quantitative study, is that when you think in academia or people who go into the university, still they get benefit because of the social class background, specifically in where you went to high school. That is, it says almost all about what will become your future, which is complex, problematic, still problematic.
Yeah, yeah. But I think what I really like about this paper and within your findings section is I think you do a really good job of showing the nuanced connections between things like class and privilege and mobility, and how mobility kind of shifts and changes understandings of class and privilege, kind of both when studying and when returning home. So I wonder, can you just talk us through how do you see these three things of class and privilege and mobility? How are they intersecting with one another? What do you see as the kind of relationship between these factors?
I don't know. I feel that before I did this study, I was reading, of course, a lot about internationalization. And at that moment, the literature was about privilege without so much talking, except there was one book, I own, I guess, that was kind of looking very, she did assume very strong about privilege and internationalization. But when you think about, at least in the case of Chile, before 2008, who were the people who could go abroad to study a PhD and come back, it was mostly people coming from a privileged background. And before 2009, there was no question about that, because it was considered meritocratic. In spite of that, the main kind of criteria was to know or not know a second language. And people who knew or know in Chile can learn a second language in high school is people who go to a highly private education, like you pay thousands per month to go there. But now nobody before that was questioning that. So when you think about how internationalization policies are created, sometimes by the government, sometimes by the institution, universities, are taken for granted. The privilege that we have in some cases to be abroad, and what those experiences could give us to learn to think otherwise. That for me was what I had been following, by the way, for so long, is how we think otherwise. You know, what is the possibility? I study curriculum too. What are the possibility that through education, higher education or international education can give us possibilities, can be a door, window, whatever, to think otherwise. And that I feel that sometimes we lose those opportunities. And the governments, with all the policies they created, when people are coming back, the same. They are losing all the opportunities that happen in abroad because of they, again, get kind of co-opted by how, in this case, in the Chilean case, social caste background play a strong role, unquestioned role sometimes, and in the decision they take to hire people, to promote people, and so on. And there is a ton of literature about what it means to be third generation in the university, and that talk about that, and how difficult it's then to navigate the higher education institution for people who are coming from working class background.
Yeah. I think the final question I wanted to ask you, and then we'll open up if colleagues in the room want to ask questions. And again, you can put those in the chat. You can send them to me individually if you would prefer them to be anonymized. But the question that I wanted to ask before coming to questions in the room is where can this work go next? So kind of in terms of future research about the intersections of internationalization and class, what do you think is still left unexplored in this area?
Okay, there are two ways to answer your question. I think it's a very complex one. One that I think is not just next. There are several scholars who had been working on decolonialism, mostly a woman coming from the South. I guess there is a ton of questions about territoriality, how we understand territory, how we understand the relationality about territories, who we are. And I feel that nowadays, for me, is a highly important question, you know, not just in international studies or studies on internationalization, but also in studies on education and so on. And the second one, I feel that the connection between territory and corporalities, which are the corporalities that navigate or circulate international spaces, are relevant. And what are the experiences? It's not the same to be a brown woman and go to a European country. The question I have usually are very fun. That to be a white woman or white man and come to a southern country, you know? And so those kind of questions about corporalities and the circulations of bodies in the international context, I am really curious about what can be next in the and future studies on internationalization. But at the same time, something I was talking with Vera yesterday is what happened nowadays in the international context with governments that are far right, like that became for me an issue, how we collaborate internationally with the advance of the extreme far right, mostly what we are seeing today in Argentina, for example. For me, it's breaking my heart, but at the same time, it gives me so much responsibility of doing something and saying something about how we can collaborate internationally to help researchers that are struggling because of the advance of the extreme far right in other countries.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. I think that's a really significant issue that so much of us who are working in this area need to be on the forefront of thinking about. So thanks for raising that issue. I'm going to hand to colleagues in the room now for questions or discussion points that were kind of have arisen from listening to Ana Luisa speak about her work. I can see there's already one that's been sent to me privately. So colleagues, I'll ask that one first, and then if you have other things you want to add, please do jump in. But the first question that was sent to me is asking, your paper is writing about Chilean students who studied in the global north. How much of your findings do you think are embedded within south to north migration flows, and how might they apply to other types of migration flows, such as south-south migration?
I guess that this kind of research doesn't apply to every single country in the South too. When I am talking about an unequal social country like Chileans, like Chilean society, I guess in that case, this kind of conversation is worth to have it. In the case of Chile, the scholarship we have still have this criteria that the university that you will study your PhD in order to have the scholarship have to be in the ranking the Shanghai among the 100 universities. So when you see the ranking of Shanghai, you see that those universities are mostly in the United States, some in Australia, and some in England, period. So it's very difficult to go abroad without a scholarship. And it's very difficult to go to another country that is different than those ones. So that's why most of Chileans go to the United States, England, and Australia because of that criteria. So what I want to say with that is that the mobility in Latin America from Chile is very low compared to those countries. So that's why my research went to that way, because most of the international students go to those the university in those countries. I guess when you go among countries, Latin America, I will speak because it's my context. When you're thinking about Latin American countries, the idea of unequal societies cross countries, it's not something Chilean. It's very strong in other countries too. And I guess when you want to read social class in Latin American countries, it will be a little easier than other northern countries or from the global north, between quotes, global north. So I guess that is something that can be interesting to see in other Latin American countries too, like what it means to collaborate with others. And mostly because in our case, the collaborations is usually intentional move toward the north, like is highly required to have a scholarship to go to study a PhD or doctoral program abroad. It has to be in those universities. So that immediately put away all the universities in Latin America.
Yeah, that links nicely to the second part of the question from the same person who's asking, you mentioned earlier about how decolonial work influenced your writing. And their question is, how decolonial are discussions about class, especially when a lot of work in this area uses Bourdieu as a conceptual framework?
Interesting. I guess when you think about, in the case of Latin America again, in Chile specifically, when you think about the colonialism and class, it cannot be disconnected with ethnicity. We were in a process 2 years ago trying to change the constitution of the country. We still have the constitution of the dictatorship. And I worked with the woman who was leading that process, Elisa. And she has been having a very hard time during the past years because of virtual harassment. And most of the stuff they write about her is about classism, is very classist kind of statements, but at the same time, racist one, like because she's an indigenous woman, she doesn't know how to speak, how to write, even that she speaks 3 languages, and she has 2 doctorates. And actually, when she got to be the president of that process, one of the questions someone did to the main channel was that she even know how to read, like that was the question. But at the same time, there is a strong judicial process. They were asking to show their doctoral degrees, to the judicial system, because nobody could believe that she had 2 doctorates. So when you think what the colonialism will help us is to think, okay, what those kind of questions or the questioning that she has as a woman, working class background woman, indigenous woman, and a woman too. There are 3 kind of reflections that the colonialism invite. First, where this is coming from, like why the judicial system could accept something that they will never ask to anyone who is already working in a university. I mean, I am a professor in a university, and it's very difficult that someone will question the fact that I was hired in a university, because everyone assumes I have a doctorate. In the case of her, even that she has been working like for 20 years in the university, the judicial system asks the diploma. And that was a battle for a year. So in this case, it's because she is an indigenous woman, period. There was no more than that, the racist kind of statements, the racist questioning. Then she has a sabbatical, and the same, like all the questioning they had been doing, again, the judicial system, asking to the university why she has a sabbatical, something that is very common in the university to have a sabbatical. And the misunderstanding between what misunderstanding the media had about what a sabbatical means for an indigenous woman, it was really complex. And for me, the colonialism gave me kind of the ideas, or give me the reflections, the necessary reflections to think how we have internalized a colonial way to understand who is a doctorate, who can do a doctorate abroad, who can be a professor in the university, who can travel abroad and be a keynote speaker, Those kind of conversations come from the colonialism. Without that, it will be difficult sometimes to interpolate and give an answer back, and the ways even that the university was protecting this professor. I wrote a column like last year after a horrible harassment she was living every day in the media, in the television, and in Twitter, and the newspapers of the national newspapers about her sabbatical. So I was writing this column about universities and violence. So my question was that what is the university as institution doing protecting a professor that is receiving that level of harassment? And for me, the colonialism gave me the language to say, here, what we have is a racist, classist, and sexist violence that a professor is living every day. And nobody is saying anything, like not the institution, the president of the institution, or even the media, they were not stopping. It was non-stop everyday violence, like, I don't know, thousands and thousands of Twitters against her, questioning that she was a professor. Even some newspaper wrote that she didn't look as a human being, that she looked more than a monkey. And when you see that level of harassment and no interruption of that, like public interruption, like because several of us, everyone who were seeing this as dehumanization of a professor, were talking about that. But the public interruption, it was it took so long, you know? And for me, when you see how the colonial conversation give me the reflections that I need is the connection about, in this case, ethnicity and class that usually come together. I mean, I don't know how to say this, but the empobrecimiento. So I am sorry, that word I don't have it in this moment. But colonization, what did with indigenous communities in Latin America was to make them poor, more and more poor, taking the land take the land from them, and positioning them as with ton of stereotypes who they were for the colonizer, for the settlers. And I guess this is still until now. And when you see about class, there is a positionality about social class that is also connected with racism and with the ethnicity that people work with, you know. I don't know, it makes sense.
No,
It's
yeah,
a very good question.
yeah, thank you for sharing those stories. I'm conscious of time, so I think that's probably the last question that we'll take. But just to say thank you so much, Ana Luisa, for this, I think, really useful discussion about the centrality of class and your work about its intersections with internationalization. I've got a list of things I want to read now, and really appreciate your reflections on that. Was there any final thing you wanted to say before we wrap up?
No, thank you. Thank you for the question, for the conversation. I hope it makes sense. I don't speak English every day, so sometimes words run away from me, and the ideas sometimes are complex to explain in another language. But I hope it makes sense. I hope to continue reading and working towards a more critical research on internationalization. Thanks to you, Gina, for leading this conversation and other ones, other more, and for positioning this. We need more of these conversations. So thank you, Gina, and thank you for the audience too.
Thank you so much. I'll stop the recording here. So thanks for joining on the recording if you did.